Good morning, everyone. It's great to have Pardis here, and it's really good opportunity for all of us to have this collaboration with Arizona State University. And we are really looking forward to other meetings, but this is the first face-to-face meeting. So we hope that things will get better and we will have more opportunity to work together to send our students one each campus, different classes. We will try to keep our voices down because of the microphone, but both of us used to teach loud. So if you feel a little bit too much noise, just warn us that we will keep our voices down. This is a sort of a last-minute organization, so we would like to take Deniz and Onur particularly, but all of the tanıtım, they helped us through this organization. Unfortunately, that's the reason why we're so few, but everybody sends their love, especially the faculty members of our social science and humanities faculty. Now, I just worked on her biography in the morning, but we had the chance to engage in a dialogue with respect to her field research right now in Uşak. So somehow we managed to know one another and hope to collaborate in future because I feel that we are also in the same, let's say, sort of our understanding of social science and the way we reflect our work is somehow similar. So let me just say that we have this whole reflection issue, and we had a new journal just 1 year old, the title Reflective, which is both Turkish and English, and it's also bilingual journal. So it's really great for me to have this conversation with you with this title, let's say, Reflections of a Transborder Anthropologist. So I will just give a sort of a very brief introduction of introducing Pardis Mahdavi. We know her because she's the Dean of Social Sciences in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, but actually she recently, June I guess, published Hyphen.
Yes.
A very, yes, I think a famous book, let's say, especially in the United States because of this whole belonging issues, hyphen identities, hybridity, all those things that we are living also in Turkey. I mean, especially with the Syrian refugee after 2011, we have different discussions on migration and also hybridity. But even before that, Turkey always in between, let's say, East and West, and all these tradition, Islam and the Western values and so on. So I will just start by asking you the title. I mean, how do you frame this transborder sort of anthropologist? How would you define yourself as your research area? I'm not gonna sort of get into the sort of more, let's say, administrative stuff. I will just focus on your work. So how would you say, I mean, how would you define your research?
I mean, that's a good question. It's one I think been struggling with much of my career. I often used to tell people I'm like the accidental anthropologist.
Okay.
Because I fell in love with what I wanted to study and the methodology, and then later found the discipline. So I knew I wanted to do ethnographic research. I knew I wanted to do qualitative research. I love storytelling. I love listening to people's stories. I love telling people's stories. I love working with people. And so I met anthropology after I kind of figured out, okay, ethnography and anthropology go hand in hand. But, you know, this idea of reflections of a transborder anthropologist. So the book Hyphen that I wrote, it's really about my sense of being liminal. So neither here nor there. I always felt growing up in the United States, I was too Iranian in America, but too American in Iran. So I would go back to Iran, and my accent and how I carried myself gave me away as not really Iranian enough. In America, how I appear, the food I ate, Farsi is still my first language. Okay, I didn't fit there. And so always I had this process of, well, I don't fit anywhere. I'm a hyphenated American, Iranian American. And then I started to sort of think about the hyphen as a space to exist, as a space to live in. And, this idea of a transborder anthropologist reflects that moment that I feel that I'm in, which is this space of in-between, but also embracing that space of in-between, rather than saying, I'm liminal, I'm confused. The book Hyphen is actually about how there's a lot of power in living in that hyphen, because you bring the best of both worlds, right? You bring aspects and you actually create something new. So the book tracks the journey of the hyphen as a grammatical mark from Dionysius Thrax, the ancient Greek, who came up with it in the halls of the Alexandria Library, and tracks the journey of the grammar of the hyphen, which mirrors the journey of hyphenated people everywhere. The hyphen was created by Dionysius Thrax to join words, to show belonging. It was created at a time when words and stories were sung. They weren't spoken, they were sung. And so he created the hyphen to show the singer two words that belong together. And then as the hyphen continued its usage in the Gutenberg Bible, it was really there to show something two words that belonged, and then to create something new altogether. So the hyphen, as it's then been used subsequently, is really about creating new words. So even if we think today, the modern world, email used to be e space mail. And then it was e hyphen mail, and today it's just email, one word. The hyphen is the bridge to create something new. It's the same with words like bumblebee. It used to be bumble space bee, and then bumble hyphen bee, and now it's bumblebee. And so I found that really inspiring, that you could live in this space in between, and that the space in between actually had a lot of power to create something new.
And actually, this is something I think we all share, very common in Turkey, this whole bridge issue, but always kind of difficult, but at the same time, the gray areas, not white and blacks. We always discuss this issue a lot, so it's great to hear. I thought that maybe we will start with your journey sort of in let's say BA. It seems that you started with diplomacy and world affairs, and then you got international affairs. So we have international relations in our. But you then moved to. How did you make that decision? Like from this IR to social anthropology?
Yeah, it's like I said, it was a bit of an accident. I was studying IR diplomacy. I was convinced I was going to be a diplomat. I was absolutely convinced. And I thought I was going to work for the United Nations and, bring peacekeeping operations everywhere. And then I actually went and worked for the United Nations.
Okay.
And
the reality.
The reality hit me that I wasn't actually doing the kind of work I wanted to be doing. Rather, we were kind of it's not so different from being, I guess, a dean.
Yes.
We were kind of administrators. But really, we weren't, wasn't doing the social justice work I wanted to do. So I went to graduate school, again, studying international affairs initially, but focusing this time on journalism and international media and communications. I thought I was going to be the next Christian Amanpour. I was, again, convinced. But then something interesting happened. I went back to Iran just before my graduate school started, and I met a group of feminists and young people who were engaging in what they called sexual revolution, or engelab jinsi. And I was fascinated by this, and I was inspired by their stories. And I also, as a journalist, I thought, this is not a story that's being told anywhere else. The stories about Iran
news coverage. They're not in the news coverage.
No, never. I mean, the stories about Iran are, the hijab, women in hijab, they're wailing, they're burning the flag, they're taking hostage. I'm like, okay, all right, we get it now, right? The Orientalism to the max. But, here was a story of resistance. Here was a story of a youth movement. Here was a story of an organic social movement that hadn't been told. And I wanted to tell that story. And I found that anthropology allowed me to kind of go really deep, and the methodology allowed me to go deep, and really start to do that kind of deep dive work about social movement. And so I took an anthropology class, fell in love with the method of ethnography, did some ethnography, And right then I decided, you know what, this is actually how I want to live my life. I want to do this kind of research.
So then you continued with the PhD in
I
Columbia.
continued with the PhD at Columbia.
Yes, and this is sort of your decision. But social medical sciences and anthropology, that's, I guess,
Very
somehow
specific.
Yes, very specific. I'm a little bit we're not familiar that much on that. Maybe you can elaborate to this decision on choosing that program.
Sure,
Especially,
absolutely.
I mean, probably maybe our graduate students,
Yeah.
PhD students will watch and maybe interested in learning about that.
Absolutely. So again, it was all an accident. I happened to take a class, an
Coincidences.
anthropology class, exactly. And the title of the class was Gender, Sexuality, Health, and Human Rights. Great title. And I thought, oh, we've got human rights in there. We've got gender, sexuality. That's what I want to do. And the woman teaching the class is a woman by the name Carol Vance. And she said, oh, you're in my class. And I said, yeah, I was writing about the sexual revolution. And she said, oh, you have to take Leila Abulukod's classes.
Okay.
And also Edward Said's.
Right.
So I was suddenly enrolled in Edward Said's class, Leila Abulukod's class, and Carol Vance's class, like immersed in this world of anthropology. And I wanted to study sexuality. I knew I wanted to study sexuality because I was so interested in this sexual revolution, sexual politics, right? Very informed by Foucault and kind of that moment of sexual politics. At the time, this sort of shows how old I am. At the time, if you wanted to study sexuality, you had to do medical anthropology. You couldn't do sociocultural anthropology. The sexuality courses were actually being taught through the lens of reproductive health, reproductive
Medical.
rights, HIV, sexuality. And I thought, okay, well, I know I want to study sexuality. I knew what my dissertation, I'm kind of the opposite. I knew what I wanted to do my dissertation on. I then had to find my discipline. So, medical anthropology offered me the training really both in the methods, the qualitative ethnographic methods, but also in the topic, which was sexuality and all the different pieces that fit together to study sexuality, which include sexual health, reproductive rights, family planning, HIV, AIDS. These were all important pieces of the puzzle, but of course anthropology was the kind of the foundational methodological approach.
Maybe we can just sort of discuss a little bit this decision on studying this sexuality.
Yeah.
And I think it's very, very important, but also very difficult. Still in Turkey, still probably maybe more so in Iran right now.
Yeah.
But because we have also our students who focus on the issue of body, sexuality, women, gender, all these discussions. And of course, like now, queer studies, the transgender discussions, they're all valid, but it's also very difficult still, even conducting the field.
Yeah.
So maybe you can say what are the difficulties you face and your focus in the field? What will be the most important thing you will tell for the newcomers on this issue?
Absolutely. I think kind of back to the title of your journal, which is so prescient. Reflexivity is, I think, if you take nothing else away from anything I say today, I would say think about reflexivity as the fundamental methodological approach to entering any kind of setting, let alone a sensitive setting like sexuality, right? So if you're entering into a field where you're studying something very sensitive like sexual politics in an Islamic Republic of Iran, I mean, does it get any more sensitive than that, right? And then I added in there HIV and sex work, and then I was just done, right? But I think reflexivity is probably the most important skill, which is the ability, reflexivity, and of course the flip side of that coin, which is positionality. So if you take nothing else away, I would say that muscle, that ability to be reflexive about your position, the ability to turn inwards and ask yourself, okay, what is the impact of me being in this space? What am I bringing with me? What is my positionality? And your positionality is always changing. I think that's really important to think about. Your position, my position in any given day changes 7 times, 8 times, probably more. Sometimes I walk into a room and I'm in a position of power because I'm a dean. I walk into a classroom and I'm in a position of power. Sometimes I walk into a room with my superiors, I'm not in a position of power. Sometimes I walk into a room where nobody looks like me. I definitely don't feel like I'm in a position, but my position changes, right? Given the interactions I'm having. But the other component of positionality, and I think this is really best explained, I don't know if any of you have read Renato Rossaldo's essay, Grief and a Headhunter's Rage. It's my favorite story. I'll share with you this story because I think it shows you how positionality can change based on your life events. So Renato Rossaldo is a very famous anthropologist, and he was studying a group, actually a tribe in Indonesia. And this tribe, when somebody in the tribe died, the way that they dealt with their grief is they went to the tribe next door, they cut off somebody's head and brought it and put it on a stake in the middle of the village. Now, Rossaldo returns to California and says, look, I'm trying to understand this. I'm trying to be reflexive. I'm trying to enter without bias, but I cannot understand this practice. It seems violent. I don't understand it. It's frustrating to me. I can't connect with it. So the next year, he goes back to the field. This time he brings his wife, Michelle Rossaldo, with him. She's also a very famous anthropologist. So they're in the field in Indonesia, and they go for a walk, a hike one day. And as they're walking kind of by a cliffside. As they're walking, Michelle slips and falls and dies immediately. She falls to a very untimely death. And Rossaldo says that it's in that moment where he feels not grief, but rage. He feels a burning rage. And not that he goes and cuts off somebody's head, but he says it's in that moment where his positionality changes to a point where he suddenly understands the tribe he's working with in a different way. He understands how grief is manifested in rage. And he says his positionality changes. And so I think being reflexive about your position, your positionality, but also recognizing that it changes. Like for me, as I've done my field work, so of course I worked on sexual politics in Iran, but subsequently I've worked on human trafficking. And my position with regards to the topic of human trafficking changed tremendously when I became a mother, right? I now have 3 young children. I have a daughter. And so, of course, that absolutely changed the way that I interact with the topic of human trafficking. So your positionality changes, but your ability to constantly be reflexive, to turn inwards and ask yourself, how am I fitting here? And how is the field changing me?
Yes.
Right? How is the field changing me? That muscle of reflexivity, I think, is the most important.
Yeah. I just want to make a very similar comment on this because during all my PhD thesis, there was a sort of a journal coverage where they explain a tribe. After their death, they ate the body of the people.
Yeah.
So that was there for me sort of to have this reflection about my limitation of understanding. So it's very similar to what you're saying. So the whole process of that the limitations of our grasp, our understanding, and our positionality with our own different hats are crucial to understand. So I will just say for our audience that you have this, your PhD thesis, I guess, this passionate uprisings, Iran's sexual revolution. Then you decided to change the focus from sexuality to migration. What is the reason behind that? And maybe a little also note, I'm also very interested in this whole issue of subaltern voices. Whether can the subaltern speak, sort of Spivak's argument and so on. And I had the chance of sort of learning this from Guha and all these discussions with the respect to their students, sort of the whole story. So how would you feel about your your understanding? Are you reflecting their voices, or what are you trying to do in terms of when you try to get the stories? As a researcher, how do you see your position in that sense?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Is there a possibility for us sort of to give them the space for their voice, or are we just sort of pretending that we're doing this?
And just to feel good about feeling bad?
Yes.
Yeah,
I mean, especially as I'm working always the disadvantaged groups, it's always difficult sort of to make this kind of a claim, like seasonal agricultural workers or migrants, sort of the difficulty of being in here, but at the same time being there and knowing their difficulties and sort of trying to reflect that knowledge.
Right. Well, so let me take your first question first. Okay. How did I end up changing? So when I was doing fieldwork in Iran, I was really focused on sexual politics, sexual revolution, but I also met and interviewed a lot of sex workers. And that piece didn't fit into my dissertation or my first book because it was completely different, right? It was a different politic of the body, to go back to your earlier point, Pınar. So I was interested in sex workers. So I started following them to Dubai from Tehran. And I learned that these women were making more money in 3 months than I ever made in a year. Okay. And I was fascinated by this. And so I came back to the United States and I said, you know, I've been following these sex workers. And before I could finish my sentence, everybody said, oh, I know, isn't it terrible, those poor women?
Yes.
And I was like, wait a minute.
They're not poor.
They're not poor. They've got a lot of agency, right? They've actually made this decision. Now, of course, they're choosing from a series of limited options, not to say, I don't think force and choice are black and white. I don't think it's a binary. It's more like a spiral. You're forced to choose from a series of limited options, right? So, you know, I thought it was interesting that these women were coming and they were like living in beautiful apartments, but the men, the migrant men, were actually in chains. I mean, they were actually in chains. They were brought over often from Southern India, Kerala, you know, South Asia, wearing uniforms, working in chains in, you know, 130-degree heat, working, you know, 20-hour shifts, living in labor camps. So I went back and I said, you know, it's actually, it seems to me, the men who've been trafficked. And everybody laughed at me in DC. They said, men can't be trafficked. And I was like, well, why not? The legal definition is force, fraud, or coercion. And these men have been frauded. It's very clear. And they said, oh, come on, trafficking is women and it's sex. And so I was really interested. It was still, again, part of this question of like the body and sexuality and kind of how policies are so disconnected from the lived reality on the ground, right? And this was also, you know, again, after 9/11, this heat of Islamophobia, et cetera. So, you know, this sort of segues into your next question. I was very interested in bringing these stories out and amplifying them. And so my way of kind of doing that, you know, with respect to the subaltern, and I think it's also not about just can the subaltern speak, but can everyone else listen? And that's
definitely
often the case is that no, they're not, because they were crafting policies in Washington, D.C. that were actually harming women. Okay, they were actually saying, you have to double your police force. Well, guess what? It's mostly the police who were raping the women. They said you have to close your borders. Well, guess what? That means women end up being smuggled more. So the policies were disconnected. And so I started asking the women, I said, well, what if I tell your story? How do you want to tell it? And I always showed it to them first. And I said, listen, we've got to bring these stories out. I will promise you that if you and I work together and we tell your story, that we will get policy change. That's kind of how I lived with that, sort of that betwixt and between feeling is like, well, are you kind of using them to feel good about feeling bad? Or are you using the stories to make policy change? And it was the latter in my case. We've actually changed a huge number of policies. We got the United States to rank itself in the Trafficking in Persons report. We got the Clean Supply Chain Act passed nationally in the United States. We got a whole series of laws passed for protecting migrant women from the ASEAN sending countries. So I think that if you kind of are working with your interlocutors and asking them, like, how do you feel about this? And you're reflexive about your own power, I think that's one way of entering.
Yes, I think that's sort of the question, even like changing it, not about the speak, but more who are listening, sort of the access channels that you are providing is very crucial. But the title is Gridlock.
Yeah.
So maybe you can just sort of elaborate on that. So the title of the book is Gridlock, Labor, Migration and Human Trafficking in Dubai, 2011. So why it's the gridlock?
Why? Okay, so I'm going to let you all in on a little secret. Authors don't always get to decide on their own titles. So that book was called Traffic Jam. And I called it Traffic Jam because, first of all, it was, from my observation, well, first, let me say I sit in a lot of traffic jams in Dubai and Tehran. So there's that, you know, and also Istanbul.
Yes, if you stay longer, you'll see ours.
Yes. But also it was that, you know, from my observation, there was an absolute traffic jam of bad policies that were colliding to produce a trafficking problem. And everybody had thrown in, you know, Orientalism and, you know, this whole war on terror, and you know, the war on trafficking was the hyper-feminized antidote to the hyper-masculine war on terror. And so you had, you know, the war on terror, war on trafficking, and Abu Ghraib, everything was just thrown in, and it caused this traffic jam. And so I called the book Traffic Jam. And of course, my editors said, well, you can't call it Traffic Jam and then have human trafficking in the subtitle. So we're going to call it Gridlock, because that's a synonym for a traffic jam.
All right. Then, I mean, actually, last night I have, after 7, a methodology course where we discussed the issue of whether there's a social reality out there or not. So, especially with respect to the stories that you tell, that you managed to change some of the, with the whole discussion, there's a possibility of changing even the laws and regulation. How do you feel like about that? I mean, this whole issue of whether there's a social reality out there that we can somehow understand or reflect, or sort of, what is your positionality in that?
On that? I mean, I think it's a good and fundamental question at this point. As I reflect back on that field work, I mean, the other question that's adjacent to that is like, is there a social contract?
Yes.
I mean, are we supposed to be engaging in meaningful social transformation? Yeah, I mean, aren't we? Isn't that what we're supposed to be doing as educators? And have we actually fulfilled that mission of changing the world through educating, through changing knowledge production? We have to bring new knowledge to the table. We have to change epistemology. I mean, that's why we're educators. Have we fulfilled that mission? I don't know if we have. I mean, all these years later, I have to say, like, are we doing it? Now, have we changed policy? Yes. So have we moved the needle a bit? Yes. And this is where I'm reminded of my Iran work, where we called the sexual revolution the millimeter revolution, because they were pushing the hijab back like 1 millimeter at a time, to the point where they're like pushing it off. But it was like these small gains, you know. First we got to wear open-toed shoes, then you got makeup, and it seems small, but together, if you take all these small changes together, then you get a big change. And so that's kind of how I think about this social contract, I guess, is that if you're not constantly pushing and even just taking the small wins, it doesn't have to be, you know, a huge gain. I talk to my students about how, you know, success is it's kind of a marathon of agile sprints, right? So it's like you might sprint, and then you got to stop for a little bit, and then you might sprint again. But it's also like chutes and ladders. I don't know if you play that game with your daughter, but it's like you go up a ladder, sometimes you might slide back down, and then you got to go up again. But as long as you're constantly pushing to make that change, I think you're fulfilling the social contract.
This whole power of knowledge and this power, sort of knowledge production, I guess, is something that we have been working a lot in. I mean, the title is of course BİLGİ. BİLGİ means knowledge in Turkish. But of course, again, being always sort of trying to challenge and being a critical position in general, in terms of especially social science communication. This is something that we tried a lot in this university, and it's not always that easy to do that, as you can understand. But I think this whole ontological and epistemological questions are very important, at least to ask. I mean, this is what I've been always saying, that trying to at least raise as a question and our responsibility as educators. But I think you see yourself as an educator or social scientist. I mean, what will be those hyphens that you will have?
I think it's both. I mean, luckily, I feel like at this stage in my career, I don't have to choose one.
Okay, great.
You know, I think that's the power of the hyphen, is you can be many things at once, and I'm going to embrace that. And be something new. I'm like a social science educator. I do think the social sciences have a central role to play in combating epistemic violence. Right? So we talk about epistemologies, but there's also been an epistemic violence in the sense that when we talk about certain issues, there are aspects that have been completely erased, right? I mean, so, you know, Asla and I were at dinner last night, and we were talking about my upcoming research, which is on Jurit. And, you know, some of our dining companions are like, I didn't even know women play Jurit. And I said, well, I'm here to study women Jurit players. And they're like, I didn't even know that exists, right? And that's an erasure, right? That's an erasure from the epistemology, potentially a deliberate one. But I think it's our job as social scientists to bring that back in. Like, what is that? And what does that part of the story tell us about the larger picture, right? I also think social sciences have a huge role to play in tackling the world's most wicked problems, right? So we're sitting here in a moment of, I would say, triple pandemic, right? We have a viral pandemic of COVID. We have a social pandemic, at least in the United States, but I would say globally, of racism. And we have a pandemic of inequality. And this is a triple pandemic. And I think that, and they're all related. And so I think that in the last 18 months, if we've learned nothing else, we've learned that there is an inextricable connection between health justice, social justice, and economic justice. And social sciences sit at the heart of the nexus of those three. And you cannot solve one without taking into account the other. They're connected. And so you need interdisciplinary approaches, right? You need political scientists, you need sociologists, you need anthropologists, you need economists, you need environmentalists. Everybody needs to be coming together to tackle the different sides of these wicked problems. And I do think the social sciences are well placed to do that.
And I think that's very important that we underline that, because maybe the fourth dimension is sort of the whole argument about infodemy or post-truth, this epistemological injustices or the whole limitation of knowing sort of what is so-called truth, but at the same time losing this whole sense of truth or questioning the truth. So I think that's very important that we have this kind of literacy to some extent. And maybe I will just ask, as also you have this mentioned in the very beginning, this language issue, because language is also the capacity, our ability to think, how we understand the world, and in that sense, of course, the use of the words, the choices of the words. So being sort of a bilingual, would you call yourself bilingual?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah. So how would you frame that? I mean, I think that's also very important as a social scientist to have this kind of a seeing the world through two languages. Let's say.
Yeah, I mean, it's Layla Abdul-Ghud has a very strong essay. It's called On Being the Halfy Anthropologist. She's a half, right? And that's also bilingual. You know, to kind of bring us to the subject of language, it's interesting to me, one of the things I've reflected a lot on is, of course, in Farsi or Persian, we don't have gender pronouns. And yet that's one of the hottest topics in the US right now. It's like, do you call them they, he, him, her, she, it? And every introduction, every meeting you're at, they say, okay, let's go around the room. You give your name, your department, and your PGP, your preferred gender pronoun. And I'm like, okay, like this is now part of your introduction. And yet in my native language, we don't have that, right? And so I've been thinking a lot about kind of how language, the politics of language, right? And of course, hyphen got me really down that path, right? Which is how language can be such a threat and also so powerful. So the hyphen in the United States was actually, became very contested during World War II. So actually, like for instance, New York was written New hyphen York. And so the New York Times was New hyphen York Times. And the hyphen was dropped in World War II because you had Woodrow Wilson and Roosevelt saying hyphenated American is not a true American. That's divided loyalties. And so they were suddenly threatened by this tiny little grammatical mark. So not just language, but grammar is political.
Yes.
And so there was this huge campaign, take out the hyphen. You had John Wayne singing a song about it. And so, you know, people were told that, you know, a hyphenated American is not an American. And so that erased their identities, right? Taking out the hyphen erased that really powerful identity. Now it was brought back in, you know, after in the 1990s. But again, the politics of it, what's been fascinating to me is how something that can in one language be so threatening is so fundamental in another language.
I think that's very, sort of, we all have to think our own languages and sort of the languages that we learn or having the access at least, because this is also like the feelings.
Right.
And I will just go there because we also have another book, Crossing the Gulf, Love and Family in the Migrant Lives. So this is a topic, especially for those of you who are more into political science, they will know that especially after populist sort of uprisings, this whole issue of returning to the emotions, the importance of emotions. Thus, I will always say this, that as a more, I call myself more, let's say, study in political theory, I think in political theory you always have the emotions there.
Perfect, yeah.
Yes, this whole, since like Plato, we can say that every time we look at the text, we will see there is definitely an interaction with the emotions. So, but why love and family in this is 2016.
Yeah.
So why you choose this love there? And I mean, what's the whole story about behind that?
Yeah. So that book I wrote after I had 2 of my kids. And one of the things I was realizing is that there are intergenerational effects of trauma. So if a mother has been trafficked, there is an effect on the child that is born from a trafficking situation. These children were growing up with a lot of trauma, the children that I met. A lot of women, so in Dubai, where I was doing my field work, if a migrant woman becomes pregnant while on the job, so to speak, they are immediately arrested and imprisoned, and they have the baby in jail. So I call that contractual sterilization. They are forbidden by contract to engage in sexual relations, right? And of course, for women, pregnancy is the ultimate marker, even if it is a result of rape. So if a migrant woman is seen as pregnant, or if an employer finds out that their employee is pregnant, they're immediately arrested. And then they're held, they have the baby in jail. Oftentimes the mom is deported and the child remains stateless. And I was struck by these policies that have been written. The child is stateless because citizenship passes through the father in the Gulf, okay? But if you are a citizen, are you really going to come forward and say, hi, I raped my maid? I mean, are you really going to do that? No. Citizenship also passes through the father in most of the sending countries. So you have a situation where laws, written primarily by men, citizenship laws, have produced hundreds of thousands of stateless people because we have created policy without affect, policy without understanding. One of the policies was that, of course, the mother has to be removed from the child because she is an unfit mother. Why? These mothers love their children. They were trying to do, even those who had been raped, when I interviewed them, they would do anything to get their children back. And my positionality had shifted. I was a mother. I had children. I had been faced with a situation where my daughter had at one point been taken away from me, and it destroyed me. And so but of course I got her back. The idea that these women will have their children taken away from them and never see them again, to me, because of bad policies, was a glaring example of why affect theory and political theory needed to meet.
I think that's also very crucial for the whole world right now, the whole migration, refugee crisis, and the whole sort of the existing universal laws or children's rights, but still the continuous reality which we somehow manage to sort of turn our heads ahead and not want to see. Especially you probably also follow what's going on the Aegean Sea, like the whole Mediterranean, let's say, we have these issues, but it's not, of course, limited to that.
Of course.
Especially in States, you also had these experiences, especially in the Trump era.
Yes.
So, I think that's also an area which we also have to engage in a dialogue and sort of develop ways of making these things to be seen. I mean, I think it's there, but it's very hard for people to understand and to see. And maybe a final note on that, and I just want also give the floor to the audience, maybe they will also ask, how would you feel like this sort of a more criticism of being a kind of an idealist, or do you get those criticism, let me say? Because somehow I always receive that kind of, okay, I mean, we understand you care for people or something like a little bit actually disturbing. And I always say that, well, how do you frame the realistic, or how would you frame the reality? I mean, do you also feel this kind of a sort of a try when you are trying to underline or make them to see what's going on, that somehow you are being accused of being too much kind of romantic, or of course it's also very related to gender issues. Being a woman there also had a play. Even in Turkish context, we have this discussion that usually for women professors, they prefer to say like Pınar Hanım. But for the male professors, it's more hocam. Sometimes, because I teach to different audience, so I also experienced that a lot. So how would you feel? How would you place yourself in that discussion?
That's a good question. I mean, let me tell you something. I have been thinking a lot about this question of humanization and dehumanization. I'll tell you, I've been thinking a lot about it because this year was the 20th anniversary of 9/11.
Yes.
I was in New York on 9/11. I watched the towers fall, and then I lived through the Islamophobia that came after. And then here we are 20 years later, and look at Afghanistan. And you have to ask yourself, how are we here, right? And my heart was breaking, and it's like, we failed. I mean, and then I realized, it's because there's been a dehumanization, right? These policies can be what they are, this approach to, well, we're just gonna pull out and let's see what happens. That's because populations have been dehumanized. People have been dehumanized and completely erased. And so there, I think there is a role of the media. Of course, Aslı can speak much more eloquently on this than I can, but I was reflecting on representation in US media of people who look like me, who look like us, Iranians, Afghans, Turks, and Arabs, and we're all melded into one, first of all. This is evidenced by the fact that when Guantanamo Bay opened in the United States, the very unfortunate opening of Guantanamo Bay, and they took people out of Afghanistan to ship them to Guantanamo Bay. Do you know who was waiting for them? Arabic translators. These people did not even know that Arabic is not the language that is spoken in Afghanistan. Okay, could there be back to language, could there be a more dehumanizing, first of all, you're taking these people and you're putting them in jail for crimes that we don't even know if they committed or not. And then you're saying that the person who's going to translate during their interrogation doesn't actually speak their language. What does that tell you, right? So why should we be surprised that we're back here 20 years later? And that for me, I've been an optimist, I've been an idealist, and people have criticized me for that. But I have felt in this last year a darkness that I hadn't felt in a long time. And I think it was this 9/11 and the resulting, we are welcoming a large number of Afghan refugees to Arizona. As we speak, actually, we're going to have 75 students at Arizona State University who start this week. And I'm like, gosh, how did we get here? Well, we know how we got here. And that's tragic. And so then I think, well, maybe those critiques weren't so off base. I used to just shrug them off. But lately I've been feeling kind of filled with a darkness that I had never felt before. So I'm don't want to end on a downer.
Okay, no.
Sad reality right now.
We can move to another story. But I think even to have this dialogue together, this moment is something we can feel positive, because actually we didn't have this much dialogue prior to this meeting.
No.
So it's the first time that we have this chance of getting into dialogue, and I can say 100,000 things together that we can work and sort of study, and I think most of you will also be happy to be part of. And I think that's sort of the being stubborn and sort of to continue what we are doing may be the only way to survive. And I really think that human speech somehow made a lot of progress with respect to the universal laws and regulations. But there is a step backward that we are in, and maybe we need to sort of change the whole story. And climate actually is sort of somehow climate change shows us that there is only one dimension. Either we cooperate or
we all
disappear.
Go underwater, right?
Yes,
no, but you're right. Actually, I think the way out of this is partnerships.
Yes.
Right. I think that's the only way out, is these kind of collaborations. Like your perspective, I love listening to you speak. I love reading your work, because your perspective adds a dimension that I would never even think about. And so I think that's the power and the beauty of these collaborations. I think that's the only way.
So I think maybe this is somehow the positive side of it. I'll just ask one final question, but for those of you who have questions, we will have 10 or 15 minutes. So can you just tell us a story that you would like to share in one of your field research? Something different or something that shocks you, or maybe an ordinary thing, but just one sort of a story that you will tell.
Gosh, how do I pick one?
Okay, two, let's say.
Well, I guess I would talk a little bit about what's on my mind now as I'm getting ready to the field.
Actually, maybe we didn't mention the name Uşak or Horse,
so maybe we talk about that.
Definitely.
So my current field, what brings me here, apart from wanting to be here with all of you, is that I have become interested lately. I have discovered that there is a breed, the most ancient breed of horse is the Caspian horse, and then
Yes,
the next,
we're talking about horses now. Yes.
we are actually talking about horses now. I do love riding horses. So I learned to ride actually in Iran when I was doing field work, so it all comes together. So there's the oldest breed of horses actually known in the world is the Caspian horse, followed by the Akhateke. Those are the two oldest breeds of horse. And they originated actually in this area. And they originated actually in the village my father is from. There was a herd of 500 of these horses. And women were riding them, and women were training these horses. And it turns out that there was what they would call a feminist way to ride a horse, a feminist way to train a horse. And I became fascinated by this. And then when the revolution was happening, women were worried that they couldn't ride anymore the way that they wanted to ride. And so of that herd, half of the herd came to Turkey and was passed to women who were playing Cirit. So this is where it all comes back, right? Women were riding horses and training to play a very old sport in Turkey that up till then had been for men. And they were using that training to also train in combat and to protect their villages. The same thing was happening in Afghanistan. 250 of the herd went to a group of women living in the north who used the herd to play the Afghan national sport of bozkeshi, which is a sport also played on horseback. And these women trained to compete, but also to protect themselves and their villages. So here we have another erasure, major erasure from history, that I kind of see myself as like a detective kind of going back in and telling that story. And so right now I've been really inspired by the story of this herd of horses and the feminists that it has brought with it.
So we will see if we will look at after the clues.
See. Okay. We'll see.
So we have 10 minutes if anybody wants to join our discussion or raise a question. I will continue with my questions. Okay. Maybe you can also sort of ask questions to the audience, but let me just ask one maybe final thing that I had in my mind. With this whole, I mean, especially with the new research you have, like what will be your future perspective in terms of your own research? And actually one more, a little bit harder question, if you were to criticize your own work, what will be those limitations you think that you have all through this, like 20 years? Yeah, I think it's 20 years.
Yeah.
So how would you criticize your work? I mean, think that you're looking at your own work from a distance, and what are the limitations you think you have?
Yeah, I will tell you, I think my biggest limitation, which I think this is why I'm trying to kind of shift a bit now in this research, is why do we write books that only academics can read?
Yes. Dissemination, the whole issue.
Dissemination and voice and structure and jargon. You know, like, why am I writing a book?
What's the purpose?
What's the purpose? What's the purpose of Gridlock? Right? I mean, Passionate Uprising was a bit more accessible, but the other ones were super academic. And so that's why I wrote Hyphen. It's a short little book, and I think that's why it's my bestseller. It's become a bestseller because it was accessible, right? And I did it during COVID. I did it during lockdown, and I was like, I'm tired of that. And so I think I look at my work and I think it's overly academic. Like it was overwritten. A lot of it was overwritten. I was like that PhD student trying to prove something to somebody, and I used a lot of jargon instead of just telling the story. Like, let's tell the story in an accessible way. I mean, the other limitation I have, of course, it's possibly generational, but like my kids aren't reading books anymore. They're listening to podcasts. They want virtual reality. They want to enter into dreamscape. You know, it's like, so I've got to learn a different way of knowledge dissemination, because if we just keep relying on books, we're not going to get the knowledge out there. And so I think if anything, I'm a little too old school. So I want to change that.
Yeah, but I think there's also very difficult, like how we are gonna sort of change that knowledge to this different tools.
Yeah.
Because somehow we also lose the meaning or the in-depthness that we're trying to create.
Yeah.
So I totally share, but at the same time, I feel like is it really my duty somehow to make that translation, or because it's lost in that translation somehow?
It is. Yeah, I agree. But I think if we don't do it, then who's going to do it?
Yes.
You know?
Yeah. So we're trying that actually. We're trying to sort of formulate small lectures and different kind of dissemination tools. But it's also tiring. Maybe, yes, you're right. So we are a little bit old for that. Maybe the new coming generation will provide more ways, different ways of engaging
Of learning and knowing. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so the last time, do you want to ask? Do you want to? No, okay. Okay.
Thank you for having me. It was lovely to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for being with us.